Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Entrepreneurship with Strathclyde Inspire. In this podcast we will be dispelling entrepreneurship myths. Enjoy.
Okay, so first of all, we'd like to thank you and everyone who has given us feedback from the last podcast that we did. We really appreciate it. And we're back again, and what we'd like to do is we want to answer some of your questions. And so one of the things that came out of the last podcast is that we were talking about this idea of entrepreneurial mindset. And a lot of you were kind of questioning, what does that mean? What is it? Does everyone have it? And what's it like? So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today with you is this idea of entrepreneurial mindset. And so I have Suzanne and Emilee again. Well, Emilee, what's mindset?
Oh gosh, mindset is such a difficult thing to define because it's now being used everywhere to mean different things. There is not an agreed upon definition. Is being used, is becoming a word du jour, like Suzanne likes to call it, and that's risky because we tend to use it so much that its meaning gets lost. So I think today we want to first of all address what is the inclusive and exclusive aspect of entrepreneurial mindset, and of course we are not psychologists, are we? So we are not talking about mindset because mindset, the clue is in the name, mindset, so it's a psychological thing. But in an entrepreneurial context, what does it mean, and what's entrepreneurial about it? So I think that's where we want to start. So yeah, so what would you say makes a mindset entrepreneurial?
That's a great question, and I love the way you've set this up, because I think too we want to disaggregate between mindset and entrepreneurial mindset, or a open mindset, or a proactive mindset, or a growth mindset, or all these different terms that we see. And I think it's really difficult for us for an entrepreneurial mindset, because although that focus gives us some parameters to work with, it's still somewhat broad, and we can include a number of different elements within that, can't we? We can think about how we think, so our cognition, how we think about getting new knowledge and information, and we can think about how that's then going to lead to particular actions that we take or particular behaviors that we have, and all the different elements that fall within that.
Absolutely. And again, and especially when we start hearing about it in the context. So, you pick up, sometimes you're reading the news and they're talking about, oh, this person's got an entrepreneurial mindset because they've been able to start a business, or they've innovated really well in a company. And I think that's kind of oftentimes when we start seeing it in the media, is it very much has this connotation about new venture creation or startup. And one of the things I think hopefully we'll talk about now, and I'll hand back over to Emilee again and Suzanne and say, is that the case? Is that what an entrepreneurial mindset is all about? Is it about creating new ventures?
Not necessarily. And we were hinting at this last time, that what's entrepreneurial about a mindset is not necessarily where it leads, but it's also about the process of getting there. So to me, it's about the way you think and the way you behave that, yes, leads to value creation, but not necessarily to creating a new venture, for sure. And also that value creation notion, it's very much contextually based, isn't it? And because of that, it would be really difficult to talk about an entrepreneurial mindset and expect every single citizen to start a business. It's unrealistic, isn't it? So more often these days, when we talk about an entrepreneurial mindset, we talk about an employability skill and a life skill. Would you say, Suzanne, that's
I think that's a fair assessment, and I think those wider skill sets are also useful in a new venture creation context. I think that's actually one of the really great things about the entrepreneurial mindset term, is that it can mean many different things to many different people. So it's much more inclusive than perhaps some of the other terms we use. And perhaps it is about creating something new, whether that's a new venture, maybe it's a new product or service or offering within an existing organization. Maybe it's about exploring possibilities, but not necessarily taking tangible action, thinking about what we can do, making the future, if we will. And that lends itself to a number of different contexts, perhaps existing organizations or even our own personal lives too. And I think it comes back to that issue of value that you talked about, Emilee. We have the power to derive what is valuable to us, and we have value in terms of our own personal lives to let us flourish as individuals, as human beings. But equally, we can think about value creation in a commercial context, and maybe that is through a new venture, or maybe that's just through trying something new in our existing employment or our existing organization as well. But I guess, Emilee, so I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but you raised this issue of what does that mindset mean and what does it entail? And I think there's a conversation to be had around specific skills, competencies, behaviors that embody that concept and what those are. Do you have any thoughts on what somebody might do or how they might behave if they are entrepreneurially inclined and are demonstrating an entrepreneurial mindset?
Absolutely. So, and I think there's quite a few out there, and I'll probably say one or two and then I'll pass it around as well. But for me, a lot about sort of having that entrepreneurial mindset is also about being sort of creative. And creativity can be taught. You're not born with it. So that's the one thing I need to make sure everybody knows. And it can be practiced, which is really great. But being creative and exploring new ideas and being willing and able to explore those new ideas. So in that, and if we think about either creating a new business or doing anything, and we think about entrepreneurs in that kind of maybe more traditional sense, oftentimes they're creating something from nothing. And what that often entails is being able to be comfortable in the unknown. So being able to work in the unknown, being able to deal with ambiguity, and being able to kind of maybe take something from nothing is something that we always think about. And these are some of the things that you might be able to either practice or do in your daily life, which might sort of help you to kind of think about being more enterprising and have that more entrepreneurial mindset. How about you, Suzanne? Which other ones would you add to that?
Well, I think you've touched on so many really valuable ones, and I think they link really nicely to this issue of collaboration. So we talked a lot during our last podcast, dispelling some of the myths of the entrepreneur as a single lone genius working on some brilliant idea, but actually that entrepreneurial activity, creating value, creating possibility requires other people, a team effort. And I think being open and aware of that, and also thinking about how we engage with others. How do we work? How do we actively collaborate to create an environment where we're all able to try, to fail, to learn, and to develop and to grow? And being conscious of that level of interpersonal relationship building and engagement, I think is a really key part of that entrepreneurial mindset. Etsia, anything else you want to add?
Well, let me say, I think we've covered most of it. I think one of the key notions for me, one of the things that stands out for me is something that you pretty much already covered, but I wanted to go back to it, this idea of dwelling under uncertainty, because it's so easy to think about the creative, the creative side, absolutely, and I totally agree with that. But then once you start putting that into practice, and for me, entrepreneurial is about action, it's about an action orientation, it's about taking the initiative. That when I see someone that just tries things out, is not afraid to experiment, that for me is entrepreneurial behavior. But then you need to be able to think about, do I keep going even when maybe the signals you get from the environment are not positive? Because it's not a one-off endeavor, isn't it? It's about trying things out. Has it worked? Has it not worked? How do you decide what has worked and what has not worked? There is a level of judgment there that you have to make, regardless of the context. And being able to understand that, you need to make your own decisions as to whether you continue, you persevere, you don't persevere, you change course of action. How do you make all these judgment calls when there is no obvious answers from the environment, obviously obvious feedback from the environment as to how they've received what you have done? Of course, we're used to large startups or large successes that have massive amounts of data and feedback from the environment. But sometimes if you're operating in a corporate context or in a small organizational context or in a community context, there isn't any clear guideline of how well or how badly your actions have gone so far. So how do you make that judgment call? I am always interested in that. And that to me is
it's a really good point to make too, because I think especially for a lot of our listeners, these are going to be your everyday people who you're right. They're not going to have all of the data. They're not going to have all of that kind of information coming through. And sometimes, you know, I can think about some of the young entrepreneurs that I know who, and by young, I mean young in the business, not necessarily that they're young people themselves, but those who are just starting out, and they kind of say, you know, I don't know, do people, I think customers really like this, or I think that, you know, I know this is a really good idea, but should I continue to persist in this? Should I continue to work on this? And you almost have to have, and this is where people start talking about that gut feeling, and I want to kind of continue to go with this. And I think it's one of those where it's very hard often for us to talk about what do we actually mean by this entrepreneurial mindset. And we always end up having these phrases like that gut feeling, or, oh, don't you know about this? And everybody goes, oh yeah, we know what you feel, like we know what you mean. And you can feel that kind of, oh yes, you know, we have that understanding, but I can't put it into words. And I wonder how often, if we start talking about this more and more, will we start having people who will go out there going, actually, maybe we do need to talk about this because I can't articulate what I'm trying to say, you know, and we all are feeling it, or we're seeing this kind of thing in action, but how do we know how to take that forward? So anyway, it'd just be really interesting to see what ends up happening with some of our listeners as well, thinking, oh, do I have an entrepreneurial mindset? But I guess that's another thing as well, is how would our listeners know if they have it or not?
Before we answer that, can I just go back to your comment there, Emilee, because I think that's really interesting, that issue of gut feel, which I think really links to what Etzia was talking about in terms of judgment, right?
Yes.
So how do we identify what it is we think?
Yeah.
And how do we then determine our course of action as a result of that? And I think so often we are encountering roadblocks, to say, in that process. Our little inner critic that sits on our shoulder and says, wait a minute, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Is this too risky? What is this going to mean? And very often we're dealing with not only our passion, our enthusiasm, the direction that we see real potential in, but equally we're trying to manage the other side, manage that little voice that says, hold on, wait a minute, and our fear of failure, right, for lack of a better term. And what we can do to try and put ourselves in the best possible position to take advantage of the skills, the competencies, the abilities that we know we have, whilst at the same time being aware of, but not falling victim to our insecurities, our worries, even the feedback that we might receive from others who don't get our ideas or don't think that what we're doing has viable potential. And I think this is where the mindset starts to come in as a set of skills, a set of competencies, things we can do, things we can learn, things we can practice to shape how we then think, how we behave. And I think that's where the value comes in, right? Because it's not just something we're born with, it's something that we have the power to learn and to develop in a way that is useful for us in our own particular circumstances.
Completely agree. And I really, if I can dwell more on that judgment issue, because when you have an idea, or in any context, you know, when you find a solution, you want to implement it, and then you get feedback from the environment, you're thinking, if you are a very self-critical person, you may start to interpret everything as this is not really working, so maybe I shouldn't persevere, because there is always that tension, isn't there, between persevering and adaptation. So how much do you take in the feedback, or what you perceive to be the feedback, versus how much do you keep going with your own ideas, and how do you balance out these two elements? And this is where I think an entrepreneurial mindset is not a one-dimensional thing or a one-size-fits-all thing. You know, entrepreneurs are known for just having this gut feel and making judgment very quickly, but they don't always get it right. They might get it right, but they may not always get it right. And they're also very known for being stubborn and keeping going with their ideas, right?
I was just going to say, because I think that issue of persisting, is persistence always a good thing?
Oh, sometimes it's stubbornness.
Sometimes you think that people are getting crazy, like, am I crazy for trying to continue to do this? Or when do I stop?
And when is the right time for us to make a judgment call for personal or for professional or for environmental reasons, for example, that says, actually the course of action that I am engaged in, it's better for me to change, to pivot, or to cease, right? Yeah. And persistence, we think of stubbornness, right? and I think recognizing the two and the implications of that relationship, it becomes really important for us in terms of training our mindset. So how can we persist even when things are hard, when we don't like it, when we're not comfortable, when it's difficult, and we persist to the extent that it is still creating value, right? And it's valuable for us. And then equally to be aware when we've reached that point where perhaps we pivot, we change path, or we call it quits. And to acknowledge that is not failing. Right? And I know we talked a lot about failure in our last podcast, but sometimes saying no or cutting back, stepping back is not failure. And again, thinking about how we can develop our understanding and our comfort of this so that we see things in a slightly different way.
Absolutely. And I love that you're talking about comfort. It's about being confident sometimes in what we're doing, why we're doing, and having the confidence and being comfortable in the fact that if something doesn't work, that's okay. Because everything, failure is not a bad thing. I know we've talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to talk about it again too much, but it can be such an amazing tool. And even without failing, just changing can be a good thing. It's like that old kind of proverb kind of idea about something about once you close one door, three others will open, and it's all that kind of stuff. But it's changing your perception and how you see the world. So one of the things that I love about this idea of entrepreneurial mindset is that you, through the process of it, can start to better understand not just yourself, but the people around you. Again, this idea of collaboration, but then also the environment around you. What is value? What makes it valuable to you and others? And then once you start to understand that and see what value to me could be so different for you. And then as we start to kind of have those conversations, we can start to grow, change our perceptions. And next thing you know, these new doors will be opening, hopefully, that will allow people to kind of see the world in a new way, see those new opportunities, and hopefully action on them.
Completely. And I really like that you're hinting in the direction of what's value to us or to others, especially in this day and age with all the talk that there is about environmental sustainability, about all these other bottom lines that we need to hit in business, whether it's through startups, whether it's through corporates, whether it's through citizenship activities. And this is where it's really important to also move away from this idea that the outcome, an entrepreneurial mindset, results in success.
Yeah.
A success in financial terms, success at the personal level. And I'm aware that we spoke about this a bit last time, but I think it's very important to think that the outcome, it's as value, moving to value creation as an outcome, very much has to consider the new challenges that we face. You might very well make lots of money to the detriment of the environment, or equally you might very well launch a successful project, but to the detriment of your personal life or other things. So again, for me also value is not monodimensional. It's to be contextualized and has to consider all the stakeholders, all the people involved.
And I think this links really nicely to that question that you raised, Emilee. What can we do to try and develop or support our entrepreneurial mindset? Because it is something that's learnable, something that's teachable. It's something we have the power to shape within ourselves. And I think a key part of that is understanding who we are, right? What makes us tick? What gets us up in the morning and keeps us motivated? What's going to keep us going even when things are difficult or uncertain, or we're receiving really negative feedback? And I think that links to that issue of value. What is it that's going to be valuable for us at a personal level? Do we want to change the world? Do we want to generate wealth? Do we want to help others? Do we want to have a work-life balance? So lots of different personal motivators there, personal views of what value could be. And I think we don't spend a lot of time asking ourselves these really difficult questions and taking a baseline for what it is that's going to be useful and valuable to us. And we can do that at an individual level. We can think about that within our teams. We can think about that at an organizational level as well, sort of aggregating some of the thoughts there. But ultimately, personal level, what does this mean to us? And what are we going to do to try and achieve those goals and ambitions, personal, professional as well?
Absolutely. And there's so many different ways that you could tackle that, and one of them is to just kind of sometimes think about what are those opportunities. Like once you sort of understand those values, what are those opportunities, and through that, that's kind of where sometimes creativity comes in. And so and again, creativity can be practiced. So how do you come up with new ideas? How do you, start to think in that kind of way? And so one of the things that we often do, this is advice that I've been giving out for like years. I think we do it in our classrooms as well as an activity to talk about sort of how to develop creativity and mindsets. But one of the things you can do is what we call sort of like the 100 ideas. So let's say that you take, for example, I've got this lovely Strathclyde Inspire pen. And you take this pen and you think, okay, right, so I want you to come up with 100 different uses for this pen, or different ways that we can rethink what this pen is for, what can we do with it, but again, it has to add value. And so you just start rethinking how these kind of inanimate objects, like really simple objects, or you can take, sometimes common problems. My favorite is the hospital gown. Why on earth, to this day, is a hospital gown still 100% open in the back? And it's really, you don't want to moon everyone, and it's really cold and it's drafty. And even when the doctor comes to see you, they have to practically unrobe you from the hospital gown, because what they need to, ultimately do, to try and like take your blood pressure or whatever, means the gown is in the way. So this is one thing that, why are we still having something like this? And surely we can come up with a better idea. So even taking something like that, and hopefully that might inspire a few people to start thinking maybe tonight. And what kind of things could you think of that could help to make that sort of product and or service better? And just things like that will help you to start thinking about new ways of seeing the world, new ways of trying to come up with lots of different ideas, which will kind of lead you on the road towards being a bit more creative. So, and that could kind of help you with this idea of opportunities as well.
Definitely. And I think a key point of that too is quantity, not quality.
Yes.
And so very often when we're running these kind of exercises, we want people to start to push themselves beyond their comfort zone. And, key part of entrepreneurial mindset, being able to exist beyond things that feel comfortable and normal, maybe into places where we feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit challenged. And that's great. If we feel like we're in a challenging space, that's where we want to be, right? That's what's going to stretch us rather than keeping us in sort of a static space. And so we want to be able to silence our inner critic when we're doing these exercises, so willing suspension of disbelief. Let's think about as many ideas, as many possibilities. We can work through those. We can come down to a single best approach or best solution later. Yeah. But for early stage, trying to develop your comfort and your confidence with exploring possibilities, lots, many, 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 many. And don't try to make any judgment calls on what you've come up with. Don't try to look for things that are better than others, but just being open to as many different possibilities as you can be.
I agree, and I think what I would see as stopping people doing that sometimes is fear of taking risks. So we talk about fear of failure, but I think a lot of people are afraid of taking risks. Now, a lot of the time we think of entrepreneurship and we think of risk taking. But when we think of that, we think of risk taking in terms of not risking lots of capital or risking failure, but actually risking to be publicly shamed for putting forward an unconventional idea, risking to be socially maybe isolated in case people decided they don't like what you have to say or what you want to do. That's taking risks as well. And I think even in being creative, as well as in making perseverance decisions, you need to take risks at that level, at the behavioral level, rather than at the financial level. And I don't think we talk about that enough. We are all very good at talking about risk-taking in the big scheme of things, but every day taking risks and experimenting and not feeling afraid that people will think you are a weirdo, people not feeling afraid that people will judge your ideas as substandard. And think about when we run our classes on this and we ask students to draw pictures, and they're embarrassed sometimes to show them to each other, because what is that? That's social judgment that they're afraid of, isn't it? And I think we need to get over that, because kids are not afraid to share their drawings with everybody, are they? They just go, oh, here is my drawing of mommy, and they don't have that notion of social embarrassment. And we as adults do.
But I think this is another plus for entrepreneurial mindset, because this is something we can work to actively address, and we can learn through practice. And I think that issue of risk, it's not innate within us. As you say, it's a result of the people that we're around, perhaps the feedback that we get from our friends and family, the way that we're told to behave by society. But we can become more comfortable with risk. We can change our risk preferences, our risk profile, right? By engaging, by trying, by doing. So it's not a static thing. And so often we hear, oh, I'm a very risk-averse person. But we can change that approach. We can change how we think about ourselves. But equally, we can start by taking very small, little tiny risks, or changing our behaviors. Maybe we drive a different way to work, or we say hello to somebody that we hadn't said hello to normally on our way. Maybe we get our coffee from a different place, or we eat something different for breakfast. All these little things might seem hard or difficult, maybe risky in some regard, but actually the more we engage in alternative behaviors and alternative decisions, we become much more comfortable with the concept of taking risk, so that we can then change our behavioral preferences towards some of the bigger risks.
So yeah, no, I fully agree with that. And to me, risk, the way you said, is very much risk about what? Because people may be willing to take risks in some areas and not in others. Where even when we say I'm not a risk taker, I'm a risk taker, what do you mean? So I think that's an important thing to talk about. But I think one thing we have not fully addressed yet is, what do we really mean by entrepreneurial mindset? We have spoken about the fact that it does have, we can all agree that it involves a creativity component, it involves an ability to grapple with risk, grapple with uncertainty and ambiguity, an ability to collaborate and cooperate. And certainly these would resonate with some of the narrative we hear about employability skills, right? But when you're trying to pinpoint to mindset more from a dimensional, maybe more of an academic angle, what do we mean by it? And so to me, I would say that if you're thinking of a mindset that leads to something that leads to behavior, generally, regardless of entrepreneurship, our behavior depends on how we think, and how we think is very much impacted on and impacts our emotions. So emotions and thoughts and the way they interplay affect our behavior, and therefore certain thoughts and certain emotions are going to lead to more or less entrepreneurial behavior, as far as I would say. And so for me, it's very much about how we develop those ways of thinking and feeling that is going to lead to that entrepreneurial behavior, right? And so the starting point that I would say is that we need to become aware of our emotions, and we need to become aware of our thought processes. Now, how do we do that? And this is where we've spoken about an entrepreneurial mindset as a competence, because a competence means that you have the knowledge, you have the skills, but also the values and the beliefs to behave in a particular way, right? So then we start with the knowledge bit, and the knowledge bit would be becoming aware of what these behaviors are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you think about the skills bit, and I think the skills are very much kind of, practicing those skills, like you were saying, Emilee, putting yourself in situations through which you can trying things out and see how you feel about it, and develop the practical ability to do something, develop the practical ability to do.
Our ideation, our experimentation, all of those different elements there as skill sets, absolutely.
Yeah. But then, of course, we are left with the tricky bits, aren't we? Then we are left with, how do you then train the values aspect and the beliefs aspect? You can't really practice those, can you? And I think for me, if you follow this idea that you have to be knowledgeable about it, and then you have to develop all the competence through starting from that knowledge, I think you first have to become aware of what values are. So educating ourselves on what is a value, what is a belief, then turning it onto ourselves, as in, what are my values? What are my beliefs? And I think this is where, instead of doing, it's about turning it onto ourselves and doing reflection and becoming self-aware. And there's so much talk these days about metacognition and all of this. There is also a lot of emphasis at the moment on practicing things, but what about looking internally and think about who we are? Because I certainly believe that people do what they, people are guided by their beliefs, people are guided by their values, but so many of us don't take the time to stop and think about what those values and what beliefs are. And these are hidden, so they need to be teased out. And sometimes that's really, really hard, right? So I don't know how we could do that. Any thoughts?
Well, one of the things that's come up, and we talk about this a lot, especially in entrepreneurship education and entrepreneurs themselves, about just being reflective. And I think it is the case of being reflective, knowing thyself, and when you get into these situations, so even practicing this creativity, just because you practice it doesn't mean it makes you creative. Just by practicing and getting the skills, you have to then think about, okay, what am I doing with these? How am I using these? What does it mean for me to understand how this is actually affecting me? And how can I apply it to other situations? And I think sometimes just having that awareness, even if it's not on a personal level, because some people aren't ready for that yet, but even if they're like, just being more aware of why they're doing what they're doing and really thinking about it. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this, why is it adding value? What is it for you? And I think once we start having some of those questions and trying to build people to be more reflective, then hopefully, this is the only thing I'm going to say is hopefully, people will start to become more aware of themselves and then the others around them. I think that's the biggest thing, is because it is very collaborative. Life, we're not siloed. Well, maybe a little bit now at the moment with everybody being on, Zoom and stuff with pandemics, but for the most part, we're not siloed. And we need to be able to understand others so that we can live and work with other people as well. But being reflective is really good.
Absolutely. And I know that this is something we try to push a lot in our classes and our training as well, trying to think about how we embed reflective practice. Because I think it's not just enough to engage in the odd reflective exercise, but how do we actually start to develop as reflective individuals, reflective human beings? And how do we make reflection part of our day? So not just 5 minutes for journaling at the end of the day, but how do we stop ourselves in circumstances and ask, what's happening? How am I responding? And I think this links back to your argument for the role of emotion, Etzia. How am I feeling and how am I behaving in a circumstance? How do I feel? What kind of emotions am I exhibiting? How are those influencing the way I think about a circumstance, or vice versa, right? Because it isn't a one-way dynamic. And then how is that linking to what I'm doing? So what actions am I taking? How am I behaving? How are those being influenced by my thoughts and by my emotions? And having that become a more normal way of thinking about circumstances. So embedding reflection in, let's say, our day-to-day work practices. Right? So it just becomes a normal part of our work life. Embedding it in our home life too, whether it's talking to your families, talking to your friends, being aware of those conversations, how you are engaging in them, and also how you're bringing any kind of mental thought process or emotions to that circumstance, how those are shaping that there, and building that process of longer term reflection. And so again, not just being a one-off kind of thing or trying to answer a couple of key questions, but reflecting over a longer period of time. And I think that's really helpful too when we think of mindset as something that is learnable and practicable. How do we know that we're taking the right steps and we're seeing development if we don't track ourselves, right? Yeah. Over a longer period of time? And maybe there are certain key elements that can be identified as developmental opportunities, right? We all have our foibles, our things we'd like to do better at. Maybe if we pinpoint those, how can we then, through reflection, see the steps that we're taking to address these, the ways we're trying to build skills, the knowledge that we are drawing on to be able to do that. And it's only through a longer term process of reflection that we're able to see what we are doing, how we're shaping ourselves, and how we're developing in a positive way to build our mindset, to build our approach with the world, and ultimately our ability to create value for ourselves and for others as well.
But if I could challenge that in a way, Suzanne, there is a particular belief that underpins the very ability to behave like that, to be reflective, isn't there? Because if you don't believe that people can grow and improve and behave differently to learning, then you can't do any of that. I mean, I hear it so many times that, how can I change my behavior? This is how I am. This is the kind of person I am. I can never change. But I think there is a particular philosophy underpinning the way we conceive of mindset, isn't there? That people can develop themselves as human beings, as business people, as members of their communities. And unless people take that view, then we can't move toward a situation where we encourage reflection, where reflection is intended to lead to improve, not necessarily changing, but taking stock of who you are and see what your flaws are and what your strengths are and be able to apply them to situations. Some may not like that, and I accept if people don't like that. Absolutely, it's a choice. But I guess what we are saying is that if people believe that through reflection and through practicing reflection, you can become aware of your strengths and weaknesses, and then you can decide whether you just focus on your strengths and your weaknesses, or you work to improve your weaknesses and make them strengths, so that they can lead to value creation, whatever it means. That's a choice too, right? So again, in that we are not advocating for one particular approach, but if one wants to go down the route of reflexivity, then it can be powerful. I think many people don't see the relevance of that in everyday business situations or in everyday practice, but it can be extremely powerful, like you were saying.
And I think you raise a number of really interesting and really valid points there that I would probably also push back on slightly. Reflection is hard. Yes. To understand who you are is hard. Yes. And to question the persona, the facade, the assumptions you have about yourself, it takes real guts to be able to do that. Because nobody likes to look in the mirror and see something that is not perfect, right? That's really hard. And we can't expect everybody to be able to do that from the off. That's unrealistic. But, and I think this is where going back to competence helps, when we give people the knowledge of the benefits of this kind of approach, and it's well documented in medicine, isn't it? Medicine, psychology, the importance of being able to look at oneself in a rigorous, robust way to engage in that kind of reflective process. When people are aware of that, suddenly there is a greater interest in shifting mental models and initial values. And we see it with our students a lot, right? Lots of resistance to the crazy ideas that we propose to them. Quite rightly so, I must say. But sometimes all it's taken is a little bit of context, some information, and that knowledge of what is possible. Very often people haven't been exposed to reflection. If you are from a different cultural context, or you've been through a different educational system, you may have been encouraged to never, ever think about yourself, your opinions, but rather to look to others or to work to sort of established patterns of answers or approaches, right? And so very often I think it's about bringing that awareness, building that interest from a personal level to figure out what is going to be of relevance and value to an individual. And I think what we'll find generally, and I'm very happy to be proven wrong, but I do think that when people can see the power of this for others, they can then also determine the power of it for themselves. And we're not advocating that everybody spends all day head in the sky reflecting on everything, but rather seeing this as a tool that we can use to help us shape our thinking, manage our emotions, and ultimately to shape our behaviors. And for some people, maybe that's more infrequent than for others. But ultimately, this is a tool. It's not just an approach, it's a tool to help us to think about developing how we engage with the world. And I think there's real strength in that.
I agree. And you know what? That sounds like a great place to possibly even end this podcast, because I'm sure we're actually at 45, 50 minutes. 41 figured. We could talk about this all day, couldn't we? But no, that's I think let's leave it there, because that is a brilliant place to stop, to say, hopefully this will give everyone some insight into the fantastic questions about what did we mean by mindset, what kind of practical things could we do, and giving a couple of different ideas of tools like reflecting and becoming more aware, which could be really helpful in trying to better understand the mindset.
And hopefully this will also raise more issues or other points for discussion. Please let us know what you think of this conversation. If there's anything else you'd like us to comment on, or any other discussions you'd like to hear. We really do hope to start a number of conversations around things relating to entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial mindset that are going to be relevant for you, our listeners.
And we're also actually quite interested to see what this means for different people in different contexts, doesn't it? Because, for example, I'm thinking of the creative industries, and people, they don't need to be taught about creativity, do they? But maybe they need to be taught about other things. Maybe they need to be taught about... and so, I'm interested in how that may work, and what angles may require more development in terms of mindset than others in different contexts, different cultural contexts, for example, as well, right? So
absolutely. So exactly. So reach out and we'd love to hear from you, and who knows, whatever question or kind of ideas that you have might even make the next podcast. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for Let's Talk Entrepreneurship with Strathclyde Inspire. We hope you enjoyed this episode. To find out more about Strathclyde Inspire and our podcasts, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or search for Strathclyde Inspire on the University of Strathclyde website. Thanks again.